Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the teach-in organized by Middle East Studies, the refugee crisis, reshaping Europe and the Middle East. I know many people will be coming in as classes let out 5:30. This is your chance. If you're sitting way in the back, there are some open seats in the front. If some of you would like to come, I see a big line of people coming this way. If you could just come to the front, that'll be great, so we can leave some room for people as they come in the next few minutes. So bear with me as I watch a stream of people coming in. My name is Bishara Doumani. I'm a professor of history here at Brown. I'm also the director of Middle East Studies. We wish we did not have to do so many teach-ins all the time about crises in the Middle East, but that's the way it is, and we are very happy and excited and eager to connect with you and share some of the Brown expertise about ongoing issues that are very relevant to our present and our future. The Middle East seems to be always in the news in that respect, and so we're stepping up and organizing the best that we can events that address these issues head on, but also we work in the background in offering classes and doing programming and holding conferences and bringing people to campus and doing research projects that also deal with these issues, and I hope you'll join us for those as well. Yes. So this is being simulcast. It'll also be recorded. I wanted you to be aware of that. We found out that for Middle East Studies events, the average is 4 times the number of viewers as there are in the room. So, and we're joined usually by people from all over the world, depending on the time period, of course. So welcome to all of you watching us online as well. My name again is Bishara Doumani. I'm Director of Middle East Studies, and we have a wonderful group of people coming to talk. But before we get started, I'd like to thank 2 of my associates, the staff of Middle East Studies, Barbara Oberketter and Sarah Tobin, who organize everything and make it such a great success. I don't know if, right there in the back is Barbara and Sarah. Barbara is a program manager. Sarah Tobin is Associate Director of Middle East Studies, and she's also one of the speakers. All right. Let me navigate this. I will be an MC for this event, but I also have a few, framing issues to raise with you. Is this the right there? Nope. Far right. This one here. Great. You'll see the name of Georgina Manek here at the bottom of the slide. She was really very helpful in helping me collect the data and put it on PowerPoint presentations, so I want to thank her as well. All right. The first question we want to ask is a subversive one. We're going to ask, why is this a crisis? Everybody assumes it's a crisis, but in what sense is it a crisis? Those of us who've been watching this closely know that the 500,000 or so people trekking their way onto Europe are far less than the several million who have been involved in the very same thing and who are now in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, and they did not dominate the front page of the news. The closer they get to a sort of a white space called Europe, and especially Western Europe, then suddenly it becomes a crisis. And we have to remember, and I as a historian must say this, that displacement of people is actually one of the shaping forces of the modern world. The question of people being uprooted and moving is on an industrial scale, has been with us really since the discoveries of America, the slave trade, and the movement and displacement of people in Africa and elsewhere in a very, very big way for the last few hundred years. And the 20th century itself could be called the refugee century, because the figure of the refugee became a dominant figure in all histories of the 20th century, especially from World War I on. And it was this historical background that really puzzled me as why people think it's such a big crisis now as compared to some other crises that we've been living through. Let's take Turkey, for example. Everything seems to be going through Turkey now on the way to Europe. 100 years ago, Turkey was also an arena for a huge process of displacement. In fact, the three major forms of displacement, we can talk about it in the 20th century: the forced ethnic cleansing of people from one area into another, the genocide, and state-managed and state-controlled population exchanges, as they called them, all took place in Turkey about 100 years ago. Millions of Muslims from the Caucasus, from Eastern Europe and elsewhere were forced out, ethnically cleansed, between the 1870s and early 1900s towards Turkey as the seat of the Ottoman Empire. And almost exactly 100 years ago, 1914, 1915, April, is the Armenian genocide, one of the first major genocides. And soon, around the period of Turkey's War of Independence and independence, there was a population exchange with Greece that was managed by the British and others that saw the exchange of hundreds of thousands of people displaced from one area to the next. And the Middle East is not the only place. In fact, the figure of the refugee is often most dominant in the South Asia. The biggest exchange of people that took place in 1948 was not Palestine, Israel, but of course in India, Pakistan. So this is an issue that has been with us for a very long time, but sometimes it appears in the news as a major full-blown crisis, and other times it's hidden. And we have to ask the question, what are the politics of visibility and invisibility when it comes to refugees? The very state system that exists in the Middle East today, and in many ways the one that exists in Europe today, was a product of World War I. None of the states in existence in the Middle East today existed before World War I. And what we see right now happening is the very questioning of what is Europe and what is the Middle East, and how are nations, currencies, and in this case we'll also can talk about climate change as big forces that are being redefined with these crises. There's of course, and we must never forget, the human dimension of this issue. This is very much on the mind of all of us, I'm sure, and especially those of us with relatives who are there in that area. We'll also discuss today the question of vocabulary, which is related to the first point I made: in what sense is this a crisis? What do people in the media or in the governments call the people on the ground? Are they migrants? Are they refugees? Are they asylum seekers? What are they? Each word carries within it a specific set of political positions and power relations that must be recognized. And I also would like to mention just very quickly that there are resources at Brown for you to follow up on this issue, and I want to mention two in particular in just a second. And in the end, I'll introduce the speakers, and we'll have 5 speakers. Each will speak for maximum about 12 minutes. We want to save most of the time for discussion. A couple of things happening at Brown. All of next year will be devoted to a Middle East Studies initiative funded by the Mellon Sawyer Seminar, which we were awarded, on the question of displacement. It's called Displacement and the Making of the Modern World: Histories, Ecologies, and Subjectivities. So please join us next year for a year-long set of activities on the question of displacement. I would also like to give a shout out to a very important course being taught at Brown University by Bazira Zamindar, also in the history department, called Refugees, a 20th Century history. That course was long in the making. A number of people worked on it for a couple of years. It's a beautiful course, and it'll be offered next time in the spring of 2016. All right, so we have almost 500,000 people crossing over from North Africa and the Middle East to Europe, which is less than 1% of the European population. But since 2011, officially registered Syrians alone, because we know that the refugee population is not just from Syria, it's also from other places such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea, Somalia, and other places. But Syrians alone, just since 2011, that are officially registered are 4 million. And this has been an ongoing crisis since at least 2011, at least for the Syrians. And there are several migration routes to Europe, as you can see, the green, the red, and the blue, and the brown, and others that are the passageways that there's a billion or multi-billion-dollar industry now that has sprouted, moving people around for the past few years. And people are being moved for a number of reasons, mostly push factors, which we'll not get into right now in this, but I just wanted to say that there's a complexity of reasons why this is happening. It's not just a geopolitical issue, but in a big sense it is. And some of the countries that are least affected, like the United States, are big players in the push factor issue. And just in the last few days, a number of obstacles, barbed wires, walls, the question of wall is not just a Donald Trump favorite example. It's something that's become constitutive of the modern world order. And whether we're talking about the Kashmir wall or the Israeli wall or the Mexico border wall or all sorts of other walls, it's become a favorite tool of not dealing with the real issues, but rather trying to maintain a security consideration above all other considerations. And we see that happening recently, just in the last few days. A number of obstacles in a variety of ways were put up to stop the flow of refugees in Europe, causing bottlenecks. This is just a few days ago, whereas before it was a steady stream. We have to remember that the trip there is very difficult. If you look at the number of people who die who are displaced, moving from one place to the other, even though the majority of the numbers are in South Asia, the overwhelming majority of deaths are in this crossing in the Middle East, and especially across the Mediterranean, about 70%. And the European response will be a major part of this teaching. Just let me say that the forecast just a couple days ago in Germany was up from 800,000 to 1 million that might go to Germany. The UN has said the EU must accept about 200,000 refugees. The EU is thinking maybe 160,000. I put in the words carbon trade because they can't agree with each other, and some of you are saying, you can pay money but not take refugees and vice versa and so on. And the new pledges, as you can see, are just very, very small, including the United States saying they'll take in 10,000 over the next fiscal year. I just want to use a very specific example of the Syrian refugee issues. They're only one, maybe the largest group, of course. And I just want to show here that in order to get to the European border in the first place, they have to move from conflict to conflict zone to conflict zone to conflict zone. It's a terrible trip. Sudan, for example, and to a certain extent Libya because of a lack of a government, and Algeria to a certain extent, were places that allowed Syrians to come in without a visa. And so many of them go to these very conflicted areas, Sudan, Libya, and elsewhere, to even begin that journey. So they are on to a harrowing ordeal. And the numbers are just devastating because Syria is a country in 2011 of about 23 million people. More than half that population is displaced. About 12.2 million people, over half, are in need of humanitarian assistance. As you can see by the graph on the right, most of the pledges that are needed in order to take some basic care of these people, like food and water, have not been met. Refugees officially registered about 4 million. Internally displaced, which has been a problem for 4 or 5 years now, is not an issue that comes on in newspapers. What about the people that are suffering similar things inside? And the burden has not been borne equally. As you can see in the case of Lebanon, the official statistics are 1 out of 5 people in the country is a refugee now. That's over 20%. Turkey has taken in the largest number, but has a larger population, and Jordan as well. When you think about it, 250,000 people killed, many times that number injured. The life expectancy in just 4 years dropped from 76 years to about 56 years, which is amazing. And there's about 13 million children that don't even have access to schools. And how do we label this crisis? Are they migrants? Are they refugees? Are they immigrants? Are they asylum seekers? Each one comes with a specific set of laws and conditions that makes a huge difference to the people on the ground. And the language that is used carries with it certain political possibilities, and it forecloses other political possibilities. So the language that is used and the way that it's framed will determine how people deal with this issue. And we took a quick poll here, study of how the major newspapers and how the different countries label this crisis. And as you can see, those that are willing to move a bit forward with this issue think of them as refugees. Those that aren't think of them as migrants. Some major outlets, like CNN, for example, have been pretty insistent calling it a migrant crisis, whereas Al Jazeera, for example, from the very beginning would call it a refugee crisis. And some label it as migrant crisis, but when you get into the article, they speak about refugees, and they do both. Here are the speakers for today. We'll begin in a kind of a trip that takes us from the neighborhood, Syria, but specifically Jordan, and then on across the Mediterranean, through Eastern Europe to Germany. That's how the flow of the speakers will be. The first speaker, Sarah Tobin, who is Associate Director of Middle East Studies here at Brown, joined us fairly recently, but has made an enormous difference. She's just come here. Is an anthropologist with expertise in Islam, economic anthropology, and gender. She'll be talking about Syrian refugees in Jordan, and specifically Palestinian refugees from Syria, which is a category that has suffered perhaps the most in many ways, but has been largely ignored. Very, very happy to have Riva here with us today. Riva is a Middle East, or was a Middle East concentrator at Brown University, graduated 2 years ago. Is now kind of an expert on this issue, has lived in Jordan on a Fulbright, and I can't tell you how proud I am and how proud we are that our concentrators are going out in the world, making a difference, and coming back and speaking to us here. So Riva will be with us. Nicola Perugini, whose work in anthropology has covered both North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. He's here as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in Italian studies and Middle East studies. And he's also an anthropologist who taught at and directed the Al-Quds Bard Honors College Human Rights Program in Jerusalem for some years. Happy to have him here. Nick Ziegler, my old school, Berkeley, where I taught for about 15 years. Wait a minute, there's a problem here in the order. Keith will come first before Nick. We'll talk about metaphors we, quote unquote, live by, they, quote unquote, die by. He's a Watson Institute, a faculty fellow and adjunct professor of international public affairs and director of postdoctoral undergraduate policy programs. For those of you familiar with BRE, a very successful, important program, he was directing it earlier. And then, last but not least, Nick Ziegler, who's a visiting professor here at the Watson Institute as well, speaking about Europe's place in the refugee crisis. I'm not going to read this text because these will come up again when they come and speak. 2 hours live stream. Those of you here in the audience and outside can you tweet us questions to Brown at CMS at #MESTeachin. One of our own wonderful graduate students, Sarah Hefney, will be monitoring the Twitter world, and we'll pose some questions from there. I said 10 minutes here, that's the hope. 12 minutes maximum for each speaker, which will leave most of the time for discussion. Please help me in welcoming Sarah Tobin.
As I'm getting set up here, let me thank Bashar Doumani for the gracious introduction. And thank you all for coming. Thanks especially to my students who have come out tonight. I really appreciate the support, and I look forward to talking more about this come class next Tuesday. So today I'm going to talk about specifically the case of Palestinian refugees from Syria. I've spent my summers and a couple of spring breaks the last couple of years in Jordan, in the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, and I look forward to sharing some of those experiences with you. So as Bashar laid out, the largest portion of Syrian refugees have actually stayed in the Middle East. Prior to the Syrian civil war, there were 22 million individuals living in Syria, about half of whom have since left and or been internally displaced. In the neighboring countries, you can see that the numbers of refugees per country have increased dramatically over the course of the last few years. In the case of Jordan, the number has gone up from 223,000 in 2013 to 622,000 in 2015. That number is now estimated to be at approximately 1 million, not only due to the passage of the last almost year, but also because that 622,000 are registered refugees. They are refugees that have come over from Syria and have been working with the UN in order to lay claim to the kinds of services and access to benefits that they can get in their status as a refugee in Jordan. That means that approximately 400,000 are believed to be unregistered. This is an aerial shot of what is perhaps the most famous refugee camp. It's the second largest refugee camp in the world. This is Zaatari, which is in the northern part of Jordan. The largest refugee camp in the world is in Kenya, and as this is the second largest refugee camp, it houses approximately 100,000 Syrians. It's a massive, massive place. It's a city. It's now Jordan's fourth largest city, in fact. And it has consistently stayed at approximately 100,000 people because just as there has been migration into the camp, a lot of people have left the camp, either for urban areas within Jordan or going back to Syria for onward migration or in hopes of settling back in their former communities. But today I'm going to talk more specifically about the case of Palestinians from Syria. Prior to the civil war, it was believed that there were about 500,000 Palestinians in Syria, residing in approximately 12 refugee camps, the largest of which was Yarmouk, which has occupied tomes at this point of articles and media features. It has been a large refugee camp that has been under siege by the Bashar al-Assad regime for a number of years. And by last estimates, the individuals that were still there were surviving on approximately 400 to 500 calories of food per day. The refugees that came to Jordan came primarily from number 8, which is at the bottom here. This is the Dara refugee camp, which was the closest refugee camp to Jordan for Palestinians. The reason that the number of Palestinian refugees in Syria has actually remained relatively high at approximately 50% is because international NGOs, advisors, experts have advised the Palestinians to stay in Syria. This is because when they leave Syria, effectively they shift from being stateless to being statusless. Other nations don't recognize their status. Other nations don't recognize the kind of benefits that they had been able to receive in Syria. And their situation, by moving from stateless to a condition of statuslessness, means that they lose any access to those kinds of things. And furthermore, in some countries, are then subject to criminal treatment. Initially, when Palestinian refugees left Syria and ended up in Egypt, for example, they were put into prison because the Egyptians did not know what else to do with them. For those that have left Syria, the largest portion have gone on to Lebanon, at least that's what's believed to be the case. The number of Palestinians that have gone on through Turkey or into Turkey is still unknown. In the case of Jordan, this particular slide estimates that the number is around 10,500, but other organizations, UNRWA, Relief Web, and a few others put the number as high as 15,000. There are currently 5 Syrian refugee camps in Jordan. The most famous is Zaatari, which is up in the north. That was the image that I showed you before. It's also the case that Azraq is the newest refugee camp. Azraq has the infrastructure to hold over 100,000 refugees. It does not currently house that many for a number of reasons, and I can go into more of that in the Q&A if you like. It's also the case that the Emiratis have opened up a refugee camp. They provide the food, they provide the services for approximately 5,000 to 6,000 people. Further in the north, we have King Abdullah Park, which houses approximately 4,000 at the top end of most estimates. And then there is Cyber City, which is a small refugee camp designed for Palestinians coming from Syria. It currently is housing approximately 300 people. So when the war started in southern Syria in mid-2011, when the first Syrians and Palestinians from Syria came into Jordan, they were brought into Jordan and incorporated into local society through what is known as the kafala system. The kafala system is much more famous for its use in many Gulf countries, for example, as a way to bring South Asian laborers into laboring positions throughout the region. The way that it works is that a certain sponsor, in this case a family, a Jordanian family, will serve as the kafil, or the sponsor, pay the Ministry of the Interior a fee of approximately $500 to $1,000, depending, and in exchange will essentially vouch for the family. They will provide, at least in theory, economic support, financial support, a place to live or housing support of some kind, and will also vouch for them legally in the eyes of the law. By mid-2012, the system was stopped. For Syrians now who live in Zaatari, they are able to be effectively bailed out of Zaatari by the kafala system. So Jordanians can still use the kafala system through the Ministry of the Interior to bail out Syrian refugees from the refugee camps. However, in mid-2012, the kafala system was stopped for Palestinians, and Palestinians at that point were no longer legally allowed to come into Jordan, except in extreme cases of, for example, medical care, or in the case of youth. However, by that point, approximately 1,300 Palestinians had come into Jordan from Syria, and the government was left with the question of, well, what do we do with them? The answer was that they rounded them up, at least those that they were able to find, and put them in this camp, Cyber City. Cyber City is, as I mentioned, the smallest of the refugee camps, currently housing approximately 300 people, but at its peak housing closer to 500. It is a dormitory. This was a QIZ, like a qualified industrial zone park, that the government has been renting from the owner in order to house the Palestinian refugees. The building has 6 floors, 12 rooms on each side, bathrooms, a small kitchen. It is just like a dormitory that you or I know, approximately 2 to 4 people per room. It is surrounded by, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, broken down and defunct machinery, factory, service kind of machinery and things. It's dangerous for the kids to go out and play in that kind of space. It's also the case that in the larger sort of campus of the QIZ zone, there are other factories that have foreign workers from South Asia, Indonesia, Pakistan, that are working in working factories within this zone. Within Cyber City, this particular area, the Palestinian refugees have access to 2 very small grocery stores. They're more like C-stores, convenience stores. They also have access to a number of NGOs that are helping them pass the time because they're not allowed to leave Cyber City. Without permission from the government, they're not able to leave to visit family, to do additional shopping, anything beyond the C-store shopping in this local area. And they don't have the ability to bring in extra goods for resale out of their dormitory-style rooms. However, they have done the best with what they could. And this is a series of photos that kind of show the flourishing but small art scene that has started within Cyber City. You have UNICEF, has a trailer where they run programs for the kids. In the bottom right-hand corner, one of my students was singing for some of the Palestinian children. The bottom left-hand corner here, we have Save the Children with a very, very active program for adults and children alike. I've sat in on a number of their courses, and they're really trying to provide the adults with some positive messages that they can share with their children. And then this gentleman in the middle, Abu Usama, he's known as sort of the most famous of all of the Palestinian refugees in this particular camp, and he is an artist. And then on the top left, he and his sons have opened up this sort of local art center using recycled goods that they use to try to keep the refugees engaged and learning and happy in what are very troubling kinds of situations. So as I mentioned, Cyber City only has, at its peak, close to 500 people, but by some estimates, 15,000 Palestinians have come into Jordan from Syria. So where did they go? And the very short answer, because I do know that I'm beginning to run short on time, is that some have been sent back to Syria. In the case of Cyber City, there were a few kind of troublemaker families by most accounts, and they were sent back to Syria. What happened to them is unknown, at least according to the people that I talked to. However, by most accounts, a return to Syria is effectively a death sentence, given the kinds of political situations that they have come from. It's also the case that many of the Palestinians came into Jordan with forged papers. There was a particular instance that I learned about where parents came in and the woman was pregnant, and so they came in, they had forged papers, and they registered as Syrians rather than as Palestinians. When she gave birth to the child was then registered as a Syrian refugee legally within the country. And so you have a case in which the child becomes a avenue or a vehicle by which the parents are trying to maintain some kind of access to resources and some measure of a legal status, but it's quite precarious. I mean, in this sort of situation, the parents could very easily be deported without their child. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the Palestinians that leave Syria are in particularly precarious situations. This is a legal issue, but it's also a social issue. Many of the neighboring countries, as well as Western countries, find the prospect of resettling Palestinians to be something that they're clearly not interested in. France, for example, is one of the Western countries that has come out and said point blank they don't resettle Palestinians, and they're not in the business of doing so. And they won't take any of the individuals from Cyber City as a result. I do lay this case out in hopes to raise some awareness about a group of refugees coming out of Syria that you might not have heard about, and I look forward to fielding your questions. Thank you. Was whether or not Cyber City fell under the UN, and it falls under a combination of UNHCR and UNRWA, which is the UN organization dedicated to helping Palestinians. So with no further ado, Rita.
One of the first things I remember noticing as I entered Zatari refugee camp, the largest Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, for the first time, was a crowd of boys, some looking as young as 8 or 9, lifting rocks into wheelbarrows for use as building materials, their backs bent and straining as they pushed the wheelbarrows through the dusty alleys of the camp. In the cities and countryside, which host over 80% of Syrian refugees, Syrian children can be found working on farms, in factories, selling roses in the streets of Amman, or simply remaining all day in rundown apartments with their families. Where nearly 40% of Syrian children cannot be found is in school. For Syrian children in Syria and across the region, the situation is even worse. From a population with near universal primary school enrollment rate before the conflict, over 2.8 million Syrian children are currently out of school, nearly 50% of the total school-age population. 2 million of these children are within conflict zones inside Syria, and over 700,000 children registered as refugees in the surrounding region are also out of school. In this presentation, I will provide a brief overview of the challenges in responding to the education crisis currently facing Syrian refugees in the Middle East, based on my experience researching the education sector in Jordan. I began studying the Syrian refugee crisis as an undergraduate here at Brown, with the support of the Middle East Studies program. While I initially focused on the security implications of the crisis, as I continued to study the region, it became clear to me just how vital education is for the future of the Middle East and just how far we are falling short. Through my research, I have met Syrian refugees in Jordan from a range of backgrounds, from Kafa, a young mother from Homs worried about the future of her young daughter, to Ghalib, a university graduate from Damascus, anxiously applying for scholarships to the US. Time and time again during our discussions, education has come up both as a chief source of stress and a source of hope, a chance for refugees to pursue their dreams in the face of extreme loss. To rebuild Syria, to enable a generation of youth to move beyond cycles of violence and poverty, ensuring access to education in safe, supportive environments is critical. In 2013, as the international community increasingly came to terms with the prolonged nature of the Syrian conflict, the UN and numerous NGOs piloted the No Lost Generation initiative, aimed at preventing further educational loss for Syrian children across the region. 5 years into the conflict, however, the initiative has fallen short of providing quality educational opportunities for out-of-school children. Primary enrollment among Syrian children is among the lowest in the world. A significant part of this failure stems from the perennial shortages faced by the Syrian relief effort. The 2015 funding appeal has raised less than half of its target goal as of the beginning of September. Education has been relegated to a secondary concern to providing life-saving services such as food and water. Many children out of school also serve as a vital source of additional income for their families, who in the face of diminishing aid cannot afford to send their children to school. Yet the ongoing inability of the international community and local governments to provide quality educational opportunities for Syrian refugees stems not only from aid shortages, but from significant coordination challenges among competing NGOs and government actors, and the lack of an educational strategy that reflects the long-term nature of the Syrian crisis. In Jordan, despite receiving the highest per capita education funding in the region and effectively closing its borders to refugees in 2014, a decentralized, overcrowded aid sector and a government wary of a permanent refugee presence initially hindered the expansion of primary and secondary educational opportunities for Syrian children and youth, let alone higher education. At the start of the Syrian conflict in 2011, the humanitarian community and local governments were relatively unprepared for the Syrian crisis, despite responding to as many as 1 million refugees from Iraq displaced in just Jordan only a few years before. Already overcrowded schools were filled beyond capacity, and the Jordanian government was initially hesitant to expand the public school system, fearing that much like the Palestinian refugees, the Syrian refugee presence would become permanent. Though 98 schools within Jordan currently operate on a double shift system in which Syrian and Jordanian students attend separate morning and afternoon shifts, the overall quality of education has declined. Classes may contain up to 80 students in the most vulnerable areas in the north of Jordan. Syrian students interviewed in an education assessment in 2014 reported both teacher-student violence and discrimination, as well as widespread bullying from Jordanian students as deterrents to continuance of education. Syrian and Jordanian students alike are placed increasingly at risk of not attending or dropping out due to unfavorable learning conditions, with over 30,000 Jordanian students also out of school. In addition, at least 50,000 Syrian children are completely ineligible for formal schooling due to a Jordanian law that prevents children who have been out of school for 3 or more years from re-enrolling in the public school system. In response to these constraints, education organizations in Jordan have adopted innovative approaches to educating refugees. Informal and non-formal education, programs ranging from 6 months to 2 years in duration that provide anything from basic literacy and numeracy training to 10th grade equivalency certificates, reached nearly 35,000 children in Jordan in 2014. For children working to support their families, the flexible scheduling of these programs might be their only option. Yet while well-intended and implemented in an incredibly complex operating environment, most of these programs are essentially stopgaps that conceptualize educational spaces as simply keeping children off the street rather than a means of educational attainment approximating the skills and certification necessary for employment acquired within the formal schooling system. In addition, the sheer number of NGOs implementing different informal education programs, over 24, has created an environment of competition as different organizations struggle for limited funding and beneficiaries. While in the case of non-formal education, only one organization, Questscope, is implementing programs due to a web of government barriers. Families struggling to afford school costs might choose to enroll their child in an informal education program that covers transportation, rather than a formal school or a non-formal education program further away. By expanding short-duration programming, such as informal education, designed to maximize the number of beneficiaries while sacrificing the quality of education, the education response in Jordan does not address the root issues keeping children out of school, instead leaving children in a state of limbo. While the past year has seen a renewed effort by both the Jordanian government and international organizations to reduce the number of out-of-school children, from 48% in 2014 to about 39% in April 2015, time may be running out for Syrian children, especially in countries with less funding and a less cooperative government. In Lebanon, where refugees consist of over 25% of the population, over 70% of Syrian children remain out of school, some for as many as 4 years. The consequences of the education crisis facing Syrian refugees will only be compounded over the next few years, with long-term impacts extending for decades. In the short term, children out of school rapidly fall behind their peers in educational attainment, while also at risk of being exposed to a range of abuses, including child labor and early marriage for girls. Deprived of school as a safe haven of support, children might be unable to process the trauma of violence and loss and sink further into isolation, especially in urban communities with weak social support networks. In the long term, a lack of educational attainment among Syrian youth hinders their ability to access high-skilled employment, threatening to condemn the next generation to poverty. A lost generation of Syrian refugee youth would mean that, if eventually able to return to Syria, a large percentage of the population would be without the educational experience and developmental support vital to rebuilding the country. Over the past few weeks, we've seen shocking images of men, women, and children struggling and often dying at the borders of the European Union, many of whom are Syrian refugees. Anti-migration critics have argued that refugees are not necessarily faced by direct violence, accusing refugees fleeing from the Middle East to European countries of asylum shopping. Yet for the refugees and their families that remain behind, the deepening aid shortages and a lack of educational opportunities can make the decision to leave a choice between a future for their children and a life of poverty. Ensuring that at the very least, Syrian refugee children have access to learning environments that are safe, supportive, and reflect their individual educational aspirations requires a shift in how the international community responds to refugee crises. NGOs and local governments must partner to look beyond an emergency, yearly funding-based approach to a long-term integration of refugees into host country schooling systems. This can be accomplished through new school construction, strengthening pathways from informal and non-formal education into host country schooling systems, supporting livelihood development for adult refugees that would lessen the burden of enrolling their children in school. Fears of a permanent refugee presence cannot stand in the way of providing quality education for Syrian children. Refugees should not be forced to trade their right to education for the right of return to their homeland. Previous refugee crises, most prominently the millions of Palestinian refugees displaced across the Middle East, demonstrate the danger of failing to find sustainable solutions to the education crisis. Many Palestinian children this fall were almost unable to return to school due to a severe funding crisis faced by UNRWA, the UN organization responsible for administering Palestinian schools, both in the region and within occupied territories. Finding sustainable approaches to refugee education, however, requires redoubled international support for host countries in the Middle East through a significant increase in international funding that is increasingly scarce as the world's attention has faded. The recent surge in media coverage of the refugee crisis in Europe could be channeled to directly impact refugees in the Middle East, as global leaders have already responded to the crisis with shifts in asylum policies and a renewed determination to explore solutions to the Syrian conflict. Yet as the millions of children who stayed home on the first day of school this September can attest to, the gap between international rhetoric on Syria and the reality for these children is clear. Thank you.
Let's put up the slide.
So in the recent days, we heard a lot of accusations and protests by several Western European countries against Hungary and ex-Yugoslavian and Eastern European countries for repressing with violence the transit of migrants through their territories and thus violating international law. So those ex-communists don't get human rights and intrinsically never did. But this post-Cold War syndrome accusations deliberately conceal the fact that the question of refugees and asylum is not a Hungarian or an Eastern European question, and that the responsibility for the current state of affairs is a collective one, collective European one. When trying to understand the chain of horrifying events and the countermeasures that European institutions will set up in the coming weeks in order to deal with what many politicians and experts defined as the worst refugee crisis after World War II, we should keep in mind that the crisis is not merely a crisis and that the language of emergency does not help to understand what we are witnessing, but rather to obfuscate it. The fact that ordinary people and citizens in Europe felt the need to perform an unusual and exceptional act of compassion and held up welcome refugees signs to welcome the migrants who walked and then were transported from Eastern Europe to Germany some weeks ago, tells us that our ordinary and everyday practices in Europe vis-à-vis asylum seekers and refugees are all but welcoming. Today I propose to read the disturbing images we saw as the superficial symptoms of a much more profound question that has to do with how twisted and vicious the notion of asylum has become in Europe. A comprehensive history of European asylum still has to be written, and obviously the scope of my presentation in this teach-in is not to fill this lacuna. However, today I would like to point at some of the paradoxical and aporetic features of the notion of asylum in its contemporary European version. In its classical meanings in Latin and Greek, for instance, asylum means sanctuary, temple, or a sacred space where one can take refuge and where the legal use of violence against a human being is formally suspended. With the creation of the modern nation state and the development of the international regime of asylum, the word has been progressively codified into the right of asylum, the normative principle according to which states have the duty to offer refuge to and protect those who have left another country because their freedom and life are under threat. Nevertheless, the notion of asylum presents a much broader genealogy than that of political asylum, and it cannot be reduced to its process of international legal codification. The word of asylum includes many other realms of our social history besides political asylum, which are not less political than the realm of political asylum itself. For instance, in his Birth of Asylum, a chapter of Madness and Civilization, Michel Foucault defines the history of the therapeutic institution of psychiatric asylum as, quote, a series of operations which silently organize the world of asylum, the methods of cure, and at the same time the concrete experience of madness. In the shift from the imprisonment of the madman to the psychiatric asylum, the asylum no longer punished the madman's guilt, it is true, but it did more. It organized that guilt. It organized it for the madman as a consciousness of himself and as a non-reciprocal relation to the keeper. It organized it for the man of reason as an awareness of the other, a therapeutic intervention in the madman's existence. In other words, the madman became an object of punishment, always vulnerable to himself and to the other, end quote. Here Foucault analyzes the meaning of the transformation of traditional repressive prisons into modern psychiatric asylums. From jails to new spaces of confined freedom where medicine functions as a form of justice, and where inmates are not forced to see anymore the chains, the bars, and the grills on the windows of the prisons where they were held in the centuries before. Thus, for Foucault, the birth of asylum constitutes a particular form of liberation and protection. The passage from harsh confinement and segregation to a docile and medicalized confinement, whereby protection means an act of docile capture and alienation through therapy. The institution of psychiatric asylum envelops its inmates who cannot escape the moral and legal power of those who administer the institution of asylum, the men of reason, or the keepers, as Foucault calls them. I do not want to force the parallel too much here, but it's hard not to see that political asylum presents some similarities with psychiatric asylum. Nowadays, those who are offered the protection of political asylum, according to international conventions, are healed from their condition of precariousness, vulnerability, statelessness, and subjected to the humanitarian procedure of political asylum. They're offered protection not because they lost their mind, like Foucault's madmen, but because they lost something else, the fullness of their citizenship. In this procedure, we could say that madness is to psychiatric asylum what displacement and the vulnerability associated with it are to political asylum. Like that of psychiatric asylum, the contemporary institution of political asylum has to be understood as a series of both moral and governmental legislative operations. Therefore, firstly, asylum is the subject of a moral tension towards those whose citizenship and lives are at risk and whose suffering becomes manifested and exposed to the global public. Helping asylum seekers seems to be, or refugees, seems to be universally conceived as this benevolent moral duty. And secondly, political asylum is the subject of a series of governmental and legislative measures that, like in the case of psychiatric asylum, preserve a fundamental nature of surveillance and segregation. So policing borders and controlling the movement of people when they leave the country from which they were displaced and try to reach the countries where they can apply for asylum. Identifying them with pens, numbers tattooed on their arms, as the recent Czech Republic case, or with other identification means, like fingerprinting, confining them into protection camps while they wait to be interrogated, interviewing them and verifying that they are genuine asylum seekers and not bogus asylum seekers who can be expelled like the rest of migrants who try to reach Europe without a working permit. This is what an asylum procedure has become in Europe, the combination of a moral imperative with a series of operations of power and control. And we have to keep in mind that this is the best of all possible procedures. This is asylum when it works, when it does not exterminate asylum seekers in the Mediterranean before even having the privilege to be fingerprinted, confined in a camp, interrogated about the truth of their suffering, and receiving or having denied the compassion they are promised. Thus, the boundary between abiding to the international norms of the right of asylum and the securitization of asylum has become extremely unstable and extremely ephemeral. Some days ago, I was reading an article that shows how inseparable the will to assist and the will to control asylum seekers has become in Europe. Immediately after the beginning of the so-called refugee crisis, Switzerland accelerated the purchase of surveillance drones from Israeli arms makers, which previously experimented on Palestinians with the complicity of different Israeli governments, the technologies of control and violence they produce. So, to be clear, I'm not singling out Israel here. I'm only highlighting how asylum and refugees are situated within broader Mediterranean and global networks of operations and practices of surveillance against stateless people or people whose citizenship is extremely precarious. Unfortunately, in spite of the goodwill gestures of emergency compassion of some of our European leaders who until yesterday administered the European system of asylum as a repressive machine, we have to acknowledge that in its contemporary European translation, the protective institution of political asylum has converted into an institution of power, segregation, and confinement. Like in the case of psychiatric asylum, the protection of political asylum presumes an asymmetric relationship, an asymmetry of power between those who offer and those who seek protection, between those who administer asylum and their stateless beneficiaries, between saviors and survivors. To conclude, this umpteenth refugee crisis tells us two things. First, it tells us that, like in the case of other liberal institutions, political asylum is something different from the liberating and philanthropic institution we like to believe in order to preserve our position as European saviors. Second, the crisis tells us about one of the many paradoxes of our contemporary human rights regime. It tells us that some of those very countries that have promoted some of the fundamental conventions and norms to protect the right of asylum as a fundamental human right are also among some of the main violators of these norms and conventions. By transforming the human right to asylum into a human right to control, surveil, and alienate the ex-colonized, Europe is further contributing to the etymological and political disintegration of the value of asylum. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks for your patience. Thank you, Bashara, for organizing this. I'm an anthropologist as well, but I work mostly in Macedonia, so I'm not a Middle East specialist by any means. Bashara, though, gave us this frame of the passageway from Syria and elsewhere to Western Europe, and I'm going to try and put that in a little bit of context for you and tell you a little bit about what's happening in Macedonia. So these are my points of reference. Bashara, he started us by saying, well, what does it mean to call this a crisis? I last taught a class on movement and power where I discussed these issues of what's a refugee, what's a labor migrant, back in 2000. And looking back on my shelves in my office, I realized that back then, too, we were in a crisis of human mobility, human movement. Saskia Sassen is one of the leading sociologists of migration, and writing against the idea of crisis then, that is in 1999, in this book, Guests and Aliens, she made these 3 points about immigration flows, which I misrepresented here because I have typos. The first one being immigration flows are patterned and conditioned by larger systems. It's not a sudden invasion that appears, it's tied in with larger systems of power. Second, that immigrant flows, in a little bit of tension with the first point, immigrant flows reflect human will and agency and are therefore highly differentiated. And clarifying that, the consistency of her thought, in a 2013 interview with The Guardian around her more recent book, Expulsions, published in 2014, she suggested that it is land acquisition by multinationals along with wars started but never won or finished, but rather abandoned, as in Iraq and Afghanistan, that puts people into motion. So what she said in that interview was, quote, the generic term migration tends to obscure the fact that our firms and government agencies and those of our allies may have contributed to expulsions. And then the third point she made in that book, in Guests and Aliens, is that human mobility is a transnational global phenomenon, and therefore it demands transnational policy making to resolve, ameliorate, deal with as a recurring social phenomenon in the world. We're not going to get to an answer by piecemeal, ad hoc, security-driven decisions by individual states. So the question that I think, going back to 2000 and Sassen's question then about whether that was a crisis, what the status of that crisis was, I think we have to answer a question in 2015 is to reflect on whether we do in fact believe that the current crisis with, as you saw in that first slide, over 55 million refugees worldwide, the first time the worldwide count has passed 50 million since World War II, whether this is just different in scale from what's been brewing over recent years, especially since the mid-90s, or does this mark a radical shift in geopolitics? So do Sassen's principles still apply? That's the big question. I have a very ground-level perspective as an anthropologist. So these are two borders that I have traveled across successfully on many times. I've only arrived at borders without my papers in order twice in my life, and I have not enjoyed either experience very much, but in both cases, by virtue of various skin tone factors, I've got through with some finger wagging. But these two borders are Greece, Macedonia, Gevgelia on the top left, and France, UK, which I hadn't realized is now in Calais, rather than, as I imagined, somewhere in the middle of the channel. I really realized how linked these were. These were only early this last summer. So I read about the 14 migrants who were killed by an express train on the rail track which joins Gevgelia to Macedonia's capital Skopje. The rail lines then go on to Belgrade, which is the main splitting point, which we saw in one of Bashar's slides in the Balkan route. So 14 migrants were killed on that track by an express train in April 2015. And this coincided with some of the worst tragedies in the Mediterranean crossing, which we also heard about today. And that triggered initial activist outrage, or at least some in Britain. So in Brighton, which is a Green Party stronghold in the UK, protesters staged a body bag die-in on the beach as a kind of acknowledgement and call to action in response, I think, more to the Mediterranean crisis than this much smaller, apparently smaller tragedy of 14 young men killed in Macedonia. But then I spent some time in England this summer in late July, and this was about the time that Prime Minister David Cameron infamously used the term swarm to describe migrants heading towards Western Europe. I think very much shaped by media images that he had seen and everyone in England at that time was seeing from Calais of migrants trying to make their way through the fence at the end of the tunnel every night to try and get their way onto trucks coming through the tunnel to get to England. And also everyone in England was very concerned with or very aware of the backup of cargo traffic in England, partly prompted directly by these migrants, but also by a larger set of disputes over who exactly was handling security in Calais, which I think played a part in creating this phenomenon. So the people who were walking through Macedonia in the spring, the ones who made it, are in some cases the same folks now camped in Calais, in the tent city, again in reference to some of Bashar's points and Nicola's about the racism inherent in some of the language, in a tent city that is now routinely and unselfconsciously referred to as the jungle outside Calais. Now, there have been clashes and injuries in Gevgelia, where the Macedonian border authorities have at times mid-August, the number of migrants arriving and trying to get through that border crossing reached 7,000 a day. And just to put that in context, Ellis Island at its height, at its most busy, was stretched handling 5,000 immigrants a day in the early 20th century. And that was when people had filled out manifests and there was relatively little control to be done over their passage. So Macedonia is trying to handle 7,000 a day. The US at its peak handled 5,000. So there have been clashes in Gevgelia. There have been deaths in Calais from migrants trying to climbing onto lorries and getting killed in the process. One of the points that I wanted to make here is the attribution of responsibility for those frictions, as Nicola just pointed out. In Hungary and Macedonia, the blame is placed on policing methods. In Calais, it's entirely on the migrants as to what they're up to, and there's very little blame attached to the British security apparatus. I'm not the only one to notice this double standard and the myopia, if you like, of the British press. So this slide is from an August 13th BuzzFeed piece by Tom Chivers on British discourses of invasion and swarm. His criticism, he just pointed out, relatively speaking, in comparative terms, what the British fuss was about compared to what was going on, and this is only up to June. And since then, we've seen far greater numbers coming through the Balkans. Now, this criticism came before the September 3rd picture that went viral of the body of the 3-year-old boy on the Turkish beach, which has prompted extensive Labour criticism of David Cameron for his language of people wanting to break into Britain, or another cabinet member who talked about the marauding migrants around Calais. Certainly that image has had an impact. But again, this picks up on something that Nicola was saying. What a picture of a 3-year-old boy is reinforce some of these models of helpless victim awaiting salvation from us. So it creates certain expectations around performances, especially performances of gratitude and performances of good conduct, as opposed to the kind of ambiguity that exists in most people's life plans and hopes. So British media, I've been very disappointed by British media's coverage. As I said, from July, I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing from the British media in July, and more recent encounters with BBC, especially haranguing Macedonian politicians, I find odd. But I've looked elsewhere and found some work that I think helps us better reframe the migrant crisis as something beyond, first of all, the marauding threat, and then the sort of flip to victims who, if we give money to the needy, we will feel better and the problem will go away. So instead, both of those approaches, I think, don't engage with the deeper structural issues that Sasson asks us to, whereas I think there are some journalist accounts out there that do, and I've just picked out 3 just to talk about very briefly. The first, basically I picked things that if all you need is Google, and you can uncover rich sources on these 3 cases. So the Associated Press journalist Sean Pogachnik and the photographer Dalton Bennett spent several months. They've been working this story, as far as I can tell, since at least January 2015. They followed a group of 45 migrants from sub-Saharan Africa who were taking the Balkan route, including Hamad Kuyate and others. So they've described in that piece the role of exploitative traffickers, similar to the snakeheads of China, the coyotes of the South American pathway into the US, who extract money along the way and probably have collusive relationships with police and authorities. They report Bangladeshi traffickers who are active in Macedonia. Other accounts make clear that Albanian crime rings are involved in the efforts to smuggle migrants in from Calais to the UK. So these are reminders of the transnational and economic dimensions of this movement. Kuyate's family, by his account, invested approximately $5,000 in his journey, which gives some texture and ground level backing to, again, Bashara's point about the scale of this business. If you think of out of the 200,000 migrants, if only half of those are paying something like what Kuyate has had to pay, then you're up to a $500 million business. And that's just in very recent terms. Ferenc and I won't say his last name, is a Hungarian opposition politician as well as others in the country. He's publicly made efforts to be more welcoming, present a different face to Hungarian reception than Prime Minister Orbán. Eleanor Beardsley ran a story on him on NPR that ran recently about his opening his home to migrants. What is interesting about the story, if you look at it, is the polarized reactions that it has prompted in the discussions between people saying, which was my reaction, this is a heartwarming human story, and others deeply angered by the story. It's like, well, this is Band-Aid treatment, this is political posturing. So you can really get a sense of where some of the debates are in the US about treatment of migrants and how they resonate with what's going on in Europe. And then the last piece is a short film focused on a young woman, Gabriela Andreevska, who works for the Macedonian NGO Legis, which is providing first response assistance and advocacy to migrants arriving in Gevgelija in Macedonia. One of the things that this film makes abundantly clear, just on a very micro level, and really tells us what film can do for us, is reinforce some of Sassen's points about the diversity of experiences that fall under the label migrant. So she interviews a young Afghan man who is fleeing the Taliban. She interviews a young woman with her 2 kids who's come through Turkey. And then this very interesting section at the end, she's talking to a row of Syrians, and the first one tells the camera, I'm not going back to Syria, there's no way I'm going back to Syria ever, I'm done with Syria. And three guys behind him, there's a guy who comes forward and says, what are you saying, man? And partly I think he's being tactical. It's like, this is not the message we want to send would-be European hosts. But I think he then goes on to say, Syria is our home. Of course we want to get back. And again, he's reminding us of a point that Sassen makes, that migrations historically, for the most part, are only undertaken by a minority of a given population. There are enormous ties that bind us to the place we start, and they have never historically, in the modern time, overwhelmed any country that they have moved into. I just want to finish with the 3 slides which are more by way of evocation and going forward. So I've made reference to statistics, text, video, audio, all as ways of trying to think about how to reframe some of the discussions that are too easily, I think, polarized in some of the media coverage. It's very easy to jump to categorical thinking and falling into stereotypes of behavior, whether it's of migrants, of East Europeans, even of truck drivers in the UK. I mean, people who have the ground experience of these kind of encounters have an amazing array of reactions. Gabriela Andreevska has one, but she herself says, I don't understand why the Macedonian citizens in Gevgelija aren't more welcoming than they should be. The situation is incredibly fluid. When Hungary closed its southern border a couple of days ago, Croatia's foreign minister immediately declared her commitment to try to restore a decent face to this part of Europe, only for border crossings from Serbia to Croatia to be closed the next day. Again, the capacity question facing these states still recovering from the 2000s economic crisis. In Europe, countries like Sweden and Malta, which have accepted high numbers of asylum seekers, are facing up to compassion fatigue, while countries like the UK, where the Conservative government is still facing persistent pressure from the anti-EU UKIP party, continue to espouse a hard line on accepting a larger share. They've moved a little bit, but as with Orbán in Hungary to some accounts, there's a balancing of a recognition of the hard rights threatening their place. So migration, I suggest, may be the wedge issue that divides the EU in the 21st century in the way that slavery did the colonies and the states in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It's tied into deep disagreements over economic policy and sovereignty, like how you do business in the world, and how you treat people as part of that doing business. It also has the potential, I suggest, to spark broad popular movements, as it did in the US in the mid-19th century, concerned with basic principles of human dignity and greater equality of opportunity. So that photograph that most people, I'm guessing, saw the photograph from the Turkish beach, has done all the work it can, arguably, and more pictures of that same ilk are not going to have the effect that that one did. So the question I leave you with is what kind of images might serve as rallying points for a larger social movement that acknowledges the larger structures that drive migration and that mobilizes people to call for profound change in business as usual. So what I've shown you is two images, one from the UK in 2014, one from Mexico in 2011, produced by the new X-ray surveillance designed to protect borders. But it creates, for me, these are very poignant pictures. This one in particular, and the other picture from Chiapas, one of the interesting interesting facts that go along with these pictures is that we are looking at an array of people from different places. There were Bangladeshis and Nepalis on these trucks, where there were 214 people jammed into 2 trucks, alongside people from Latin America. So as in the 19th century, in the 18th and 19th century America, the path of history, I think, will depend on how effectively advocates for justice can expand the horizons of publics who have come to identify more closely with borders and the status quo they represent than with the human beings trying to cross them. And in so doing, compel us to recognize them in us and us in them.
My name is Nick Ziegler. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this teach-in. As my bio shows, I am a political scientist. I am not a specialist in migration studies or in the Middle East. I'm not even an international lawyer. I normally study political economy of Western Europe, but I'm very glad to have a chance to contribute to this teach-in because I think the events that previous speakers have discussed are so important, and they are every bit as important for Europe as for the flows of displaced persons who are trying to reach Europe. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to say a few things about a number of collisions that are shaping Europe's place in the refugee crisis, and they're collisions of very different kinds. There is, first of all, a real collision between international law in the shape of the agreements about refugee status on the one hand, and on the other hand, national law. International laws are usually considered weak. National laws have the coercive force of the state behind them, and because refugees, the status of refugees is protected under international law, this particular tension really matters. At the same time, it's a very abstract, conceptual tension, and it doesn't seem to make much sense unless we can relate it to the kind of concrete encounters and interactions that we've been hearing about. And that's one of the reasons I'm so glad to have a chance to say a few words, because the second collision that shapes Europe's place in this crisis is the collision between the power of the nation state and the very real predicament of displaced individuals and families who are trying to find a new home, and in many cases are in fact grappling with the basic effort at survival. And that's, of course, an encounter that we can understand when we see it and read about it much more easily than we can understand the collision between international law and national law. But I hope to say a few things about both of these collisions by touching briefly on 4 topics. Europe's rules, what are Europe's rules for treating migration and asylum? I'll speak secondly a little bit about the geography of the current challenge facing European countries. We've already heard a great deal about the magnitude of the challenge. And then I want to say something about the contrast we observe, and these are really more than contrasts. They are very dramatic variations in the way different European countries are responding to the current refugee crisis or emergency. And in particular, time permitting, I'll say a few things about the reasons behind the contrast in the way the German and Hungarian officials have responded to this crisis. And partly because I'm a political scientist and because politics is the realm of practical action and intervention, I'll say a few things about who can do what to improve the way refugees trying to reach Europe are being dealt with. Although I do that with a great deal of modesty, because I think previous speakers have pointed out that the magnitude of the current refugee flows are not at all limited to Europe. This is a worldwide problem. The numbers of displaced persons in other parts of the world are really much larger. But Europe is a very interesting case, and it is one of the important destinations. On the first topic, Europe's rules. Well, there are 3 overlapping layers of rules for treating the movement of individuals through Europe. The overarching framework that's relevant for understanding this is the so-called Schengen zone. This is a zone made up of 25 countries. It's not perfectly, but largely coextensive with the European Union, within which individuals can move freely without any border controls if they are citizens or legal residents of the member countries. In other words, this is a system or regime for the freedom of movement within the European Union. The outer perimeter borders of the European Union are governed by a different set of rules. Non-citizens coming into Europe from other parts of the world are subject to immigration laws, and quite curiously, there is no unified system of immigration law for the European Union. Immigration law, which determines which newcomers can become legal residents or permanent residents, those laws are set by the individual member countries. The only exception is this category that we call asylum or registered refugee status, which is a status protected under the 1951 UN Convention on the Treatment of Refugees, and it is also protected by the European Union. So for 2 different levels of international law, the UN Convention and the European Union, those individuals who are registered refugees or applying for refugee status have some degree of protection. What's critical in this situation is that the application of EU law and UN law for the protection of refugees and asylum seekers, the application of this law is not undertaken by some uniform international body. The encounters that we've been hearing about occur between displaced persons and the employees or representatives of individual countries, nation states. These are immigration authorities, law enforcement authorities, airport personnel, transportation personnel. And because these are encounters between representatives of nation states and displaced persons, they really happen in very, very different ways from country to country. To understand the overall framework, it's perhaps useful to take a quick look at what the Schengen zone looks like, because this is the geography that is shaping the flow and choice of destinations for many refugees. The Schengen countries here are in lighter blue. The green countries are EU member countries that are not part of this zone of free movement, and particularly important among these countries are Germany, which is one of the main destination countries. On this map, it's labeled HR. That is Croatia, which is an EU member country. It's a non-Schengen country, but many refugees have been, in the last 72 hours, trying to reach the Schengen zone through, through Croatia and Hungary, which is here. Hungary is a Schengen zone country, but as we've heard, has been very reluctant to allow the free flow of refugees. This geography means that the critical borders in question are those between the Western Balkan countries, especially Serbia and Hungary, this boundary right here, where the Hungarian government has erected a fence. In the last 72 hours, the boundary between Croatia and Hungary has become contested, and the Hungarian government under Viktor Orban has announced plans to build a fence there also. This map shows the preferred route until recently of many Middle Eastern refugees trying to get into Europe and the Schengen zone. Just in the last couple of days, as Hungarian law enforcement has cracked down on many of the crossing points, there's been some movement through Croatia, but that is also now quite problematic. Events are changing on the ground as we speak. And the way to make sense of them, I think, is to try to get a sense of why different country responses vary as much as they do. This is, first of all, the result of the tension I mentioned between international law and national law. The European Union itself supports a uniform application of the 1951 Convention. But what does the European Union do? It's a set of institutions, mostly in Brussels, that issue guidelines for the way member countries are supposed to respond to displaced persons who are applying for refugee status, the kinds of resources they're supposed to be given for a particular length of time while their applications for refugee status are being considered. But the EU does not execute any of these actions. It is, again, the member countries which do this. And what we see is terrific variation. I think the first line of difference is between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, exemplified by the contrast between Germany and Hungary. As Nicola mentioned, many Germans seemed, almost in a slightly self-congratulatory way, to be welcoming refugees into Germany. At the same time, the German government has pledged to consider up to 800,000 applications for refugee status this year. It has committed real resources to this problem. And Angela Merkel, Chancellor in Germany, has taken a real leadership role, I think, in telling her German compatriots that it is part of their responsibility to adopt a very open, supportive posture toward the refugee emergency on their borders. Viktor Orban, as Prime Minister of Hungary, has by contrast taken every opportunity to create obstacles to the flow of migrants from the Western Balkans. How do we explain this difference? Both countries are signatories to the Refugee Convention. Both are inside the Schengen zone. So what is the difference in terms of political causes? Well, part of the difference stems from historical legacies. Germany and other West European member countries of the European Union are more prosperous than their Eastern European counterparts. Those countries are, of course, post-socialist countries. They are not as prosperous. They were also sheltered from ethnic and religious diversity by the closed borders they lived with under Soviet control for 4 decades, in a way even 5 decades, if you go back to Nazi control from the late 30s through 1945. So these historical differences really make a difference on the ground. There are large segments of the populations in several East European countries, although many exceptions at the individual level as well. I think it's very important to keep Keith Brown's warning against categorical thinking in mind here. I'm discussing countries as whole units because national laws really matter, but of course countries are made up of towns, regions, and individuals, and we observe great variation within these units. Nonetheless, there is a clear historic legacy of suspicion toward outsiders all over the world, but it seems to be more pronounced in many of the post-socialist countries of Eastern Europe, at least than in Germany at the moment in response to this particular crisis. I think we also, though, have to look at leadership quality and the difference between Angela Merkel and Viktor Orban. Elected leaders have a great deal of discretion in responding to emergency situations like refugee flows, and these two leaders have used their discretion quite differently in this circumstance. There are also other cross-country differences. It's not only a matter of Western versus Eastern Europe. The difference between, for example, Sweden, very open toward migrants, versus Denmark is very notable, something we could talk about in a little bit. Let me move more quickly because I know we want to have some time for question and answer. Who can do what? Summarizing very briefly, elected leaders, of course, need to be judged and held accountable for the tone, the allocation of resources that they establish. Non-governmental organizations and nonprofit organizations have an extremely large role to play in these kinds of emergencies. Ongoing bureaucratic structures of the nation state never have the surge capacity to deal with these kinds of emergencies, which leaves an absolutely critical space for NGOs and nonprofits, and individuals and person-to-person contacts can often matter decisively for the kind of on-the-ground encounters that we've seen. I have several other slides I'm not going to go through that provide details and some examples on channels of interventions of all these kinds for anybody who is interested. But since time is short, let me conclude simply by saying, after useful websites, thank you very much.
May I invite the speakers to come to the stage, please? And I'm going to ask Sarah to see if she has some question from the Twitter world while people line up on both sides, if you would like, to ask questions. There's a microphone in either aisle. Yes, that's good. That's where you are. Is excellent. We'll just wait 1 second for people to rush out that have to leave at 7 o'clock. They were very patient while we ran a few minutes over time. All right. Great. Thank you very much. So I'll start with you.
Should I say my name?
Yes, please.
I'm Fiore Brahana. I'm a doctoral student in the Department of Anthropology. And I was in Italy this summer working with Eritrean refugees, who are the second largest population of refugees coming to Europe, passing through the Mediterranean, and that large number of deaths that you see through the passage between Libya and Italy are Eritrean refugees. But one thing I kind of there were a few things that I wanted to say. First, on the topic of asylum shopping, which was something that had come up. One of the reasons why you see this kind of movement through, for example, Hungary and Italy as points of transit is because of the Dublin Accords. And so that was a constant theme that came up in my conversations with many refugees who are in transit, which stipulates that the first EU member country that you land in is the country that you should apply for asylum. But since each country has very different means of dealing with asylum procedures, for some people, staying in Italy might be a death sentence because of the kind of institutional abandonment that exists in certain places. But the other thing that I kind of wanted to talk about was, that I wanted to mention, was this intersection between security, terrorism, and migration, and these kind of neoconservative interventions that have kind of created some of the misery in terms of the migration routes that you're seeing. For example, for a lot of Eritrean refugees who pass through Libya, what you see is kind of a regime of racialized violence against sub-Saharan Africans that kind of corresponds to what the military removal of what was his name again? Gaddafi. And so you have also the UNHCR has been concomitantly defunded, and you have these refugee camps in Sudan of 70,000 people, 100,000 people in Ethiopia. But security and anti-terrorism somehow have taken this priority, and when we talk about these things, there is kind of a lack of a connection between the confluence between securitization, migration, and the fallout of these neoconservative interventionist policies that have created a lot of this human misery that we're seeing.
Thank you very much for those comments. I'll take them as comments, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Richard Lobin from the Naval War College. And the last question, which was raised by the last speaker, is what can an individual do? And by way of sort of public information, I do political asylum cases, and I've always won. I've handled scores and scores of them, almost all from Africa. And so if anyone has any particular needs, they can approach me and we can discuss that. My question, I think it's hard to know because they're all so fascinating, but I think as the bona fide Middle Easternist, it should be directed to Sarah. And I'm grateful for the clarification that this is not really new, and it's not really a crisis proportionate to the other areas, as Bashara has very eloquently identified. I think that's really important. And so my question basically to you as a Middle Eastern specialist is, why is the catastrophe in the Middle East, to differentiate it from the lesser crisis of Europe, so poorly addressed by political, diplomatic, or military means? Because indeed, if those crises of vacuum regimes and failed military regimes and US intervention in the various places hadn't taken place, we would not be seeing these refugees in Europe. So just to be explicit, why is the source of the genuine source of the genuine catastrophe relatively neglected, and why have we focused instead on the crisis situation?
Thank you so much for your question. It's a really important one, and I think you did touch on, and as did everyone else, actually, a large portion of that answer, which is that it matters less if it's not at our doorstep, right? But I think that the underlying question that you're asking is really an important one, which is why are we focused so heavily on the refugee crises and what we can do about it, rather than asking how in the world do we stop Assad? And what happens if we do stop him? Because that is, in fact, the larger question that has to be addressed in order to keep people alive, I mean, in a very fundamental kind of way. And I regret that the international community has not turned their attention to those very questions outside of a few sort of flip marks at the most recent GOP debates. It has not been addressed in a really systematic way that it really will require in order for stability to return not only more closely in the region, but across the continents as well.
Thank you. Sarah, you let me know when you're ready, please.
Thank you. Kevin DeJesus, Johnson Wales University. Outstanding presentations. Thank you. In terms of framing this concern and this massive flow of people, one way that we could consider it is a geography of resistance, particularly in the face of, particularly as the work of Rachel Silvey comes to mind, immobilities and the structural barriers and the structural forces which are intended to cement those immobilities. So I wanted to ask you in terms of what you see as an impact in a longer range in terms of nation-state relations in Europe, and I think it was aptly described as becoming the most divisive crisis in Europe, perhaps since slavery. So I think that's very important, particularly as the question of how can resource distribution among the European Union occur in a way that can be beneficial both to local communities and refugee communities. And also, one more question, if I may. I'm interested to hear about the situation in Jordan in terms of resources. The outstanding work of Alison Harnett at Oxford really has articulated and elucidated the very serious matters of things like water, those kind of things. So in terms of everyday life, I'd be keen to hear about that. Thank you.
Would like to take on this question. Riva, would you like to crack it?
Yeah, I
please?
mean, so we're 5 years into the conflict right now. That means theoretically we should be moving beyond issues of basic water and sanitation. Jordan has also effectively closed its border to refugees since 2014. They've let in some refugees, but it's nowhere near the 10,000 refugees that were arriving per day in late 2012 and 2013. I can speak at least for the education sector, which is what I've researched, is the refugee response sector as a whole tends to react to things rather than preempt things, which is, it's a crisis in motion right now. So we, of course, are reacting to things. But you would think that after several refugee crises in the region, and I'm using the word crisis because it is a sort of, when 25% of your population increases, it is a crisis in terms of resources and in terms of infrastructure. So I would say one of the main reasons why resources aren't being channeled effectively is decentralization. I think there's an aid economy that's going on right now, in Jordan at least, because as virtue of being one of the biggest allies of the US in the region, it has the highest per capita USAID funding for education in the region. It's second overall only to Afghanistan, and yet their schools are still overcrowded. So it's really a question of decentralization of resources in terms of what NGOs are really working on these issues in terms of providing services to refugees. And then also, it's inherently political. Do we want these refugees to stay? Is providing them with full resources, is providing them with labor rights going to make them stay? And yes, possibly. So.
Can I add one short point to this? So on the case of water, for example, in Cyber City, the dormitory brings in approximately 32 liters of water per person per day. This is more water than Jordanians are allotted by the Jordanian government. And so there was one week, in fact, where I, in my apartment in Amman, ran out of water. We had no more water, so I had to buy water to shower with, at the same time that the Syrians had more. And the Jordanians do feel, from at least in this area, a sense of resentment, that there are more resources allocated to refugees than are allocated to them. I mean, that's the sentiment, and that's the feeling. And there are also these very important kind of cultural differences. So the Syrians that had come in, I mean, for the Western mind to sort of look at the Middle East and say, oh, well, you know, Syrians can move to Jordan or Lebanon because they're the same place, or, you know, these distinctions are arbitrary based on lines that were drawn in a post-war environment, really does a disservice to the kinds of linguistic and cultural differences that do exist between these places and have been further entrenched and made more durable because of the refugee crisis.
So Franco, and then you.
Franco.
and then- Yes, please.
Franco Preparato from Computer Science. My question is somewhat related to the one that was posed by Richard before. And that is, okay, we have this phenomenal, this catastrophe that is the migrant crisis. But basically, we have just the whole panel, with few exceptions, post the timeline as if something that we have to face today. How can we react today? Well, this crisis entails an enormous financial responsibility of having to take care of these people. I mean, there are 5 million people maybe that are being displaced, and no discussion has been made of the causes of this crisis. Basically, in the Middle East, there were horrible dictatorships, but there were functioning societies before. 30 years ago, there was no such migrant crisis. The countries or these nation states that have created this crisis have contributed through destabilization to the creation of this crisis. They bear the financial responsibility of taking care of this solution. And that is, how do we think that this, how is it possible that the United States only plans to take 10,000 people, and Germany, that did not actively militarily participate in the destabilization, is taking 800,000 people?
It's not fair, is it? But we'll take that as a comment as well. I mean, there's incredible variations in the story from our first person who asked the question. There's a racialization of this entire issue that really creates certain distinctions. But what do we think and how do we treat different kinds of refugees who are involved in the same area? It's very clear. And the question of where do these countries that have helped to destabilize the entire region after the end of the Cold War and the first invasion of Iraq and the second invasion of Iraq, invasion of Afghanistan and so on, where they stand is also, it's still an open question, but we'll just leave it as that. It's part of a larger structural issue that I hope we've elucidated. Yes, please.
My name is Carson Moore. I'm a political science student at Rhode Island College. So my question is, first, there's this, we talk about how this has been happening, happened before, but as soon as it gets to the borders of a Western country, people start talking about it and it comes into focus. I really want to question, what are the consequences? People think, this considering the role of like nation states as opposed to the EU and the supranational level, how are we to consider the consequences of how this is handled for, how academia and people look at, the role of nation states and actors in political science?
Nick?
Well, this is a very serious question, and I think there's no good answer to it except to remember that the power of the nation state is a double-edged reality. When it is directed against you, it's terrible. Speaking slightly more analytically, when the power of a nation state is directed against whole groups of people because of ascribed characteristics or assigned statuses, then nation states are doing things that we should all try to prevent them from doing. On the other hand, it is nation states which preserve a minimum kind of social order which enables most of their citizens to continue life in some kind of basic order. And that's the conservative bias of political science as a discipline, that we tend to illuminate the value of these rather abstract institutions for preserving order, because of course the origin for a major part of the refugee emergency that we're talking about today is a civil war. It's the breakdown of nation-state order in Syria in particular, and the other breakdowns of nation-states elsewhere in the Middle East, which is creating this terrible terrible chaos. So, you know, I think we've been living with this construction of political order since, you know, some people would say 1815. The standard date is, of course, 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. That's the European example. And there's no escape from the double-edged nature of the nation state. We simply have to recognize that this is the fundamental form of political order, and it's terrible when it goes wrong, but there's a reason it exists.
All right.
That's a reflection more than an answer.
Marco?
Michael Kennedy, sociology in Watson. So to take an inspiration from Sarah, to put it to our European colleagues, to let you know the question with which I conclude. Spell out the dystopian nightmare that is about to happen. And here's the riff. I think one of the things that's really important for us to be thinking about in these times is whether this is not only a social crisis, whether this is not only a humanitarian crisis, but that this is the reason we should be spending much more time thinking about this, is that this is a systemic crisis. This is promising to break all sorts of systems that exist structuring the world. And I'm reading my colleagues in Hungary talking about the ways in which the conflicts in Hungary are escalating to such an extent which may be good for getting rid of the near-fascist Viktor Orban. But I'm also reading the tweets of my former colleague in sociology, now foreign minister of Croatia, Vesna Pusic, who's talking about 13,000 refugees coming into Croatia, this person being the most, you know, sort of like visionary person there is, but without the infrastructure, taking refugees from Croatia to the border of Hungary and leaving them there to try to press into Hungary, while Orban says, we will not let them pass. Now, this is like just another drip. But these drips are spreading all over the European Union. They're spreading all over between the European Union and its allies. So this is the question with which I would conclude. Because we're not motivated to solve problems by social crisis. We're not motivated to solve problems by humanitarian crisis. We can be motivated to solve problems when systemic crisis looms. Just like when the Greeks threatened to leave the euro, folks mobilized. We need to mobilize now to address this humanitarian and social crisis on its own terms, but also because of the dystopian systemic future you all will soon lay out.
So do you have that in mind?
Well, I think it's a...
And I'll just say, because all three of you will probably want to say something about that, that if you could make it brief.
I think it's a brilliant question, and the Croatian example is especially telling because that is a place where intentions are good and the simple infrastructure doesn't exist. That's why Croatia announced, I think 2.5 days ago, that it would help try to solve the problem and almost immediately found itself unable to do so. My brief answer is that the European Union as a system has, for the last 20 or 30 years, rarely responded to much at all unless it was under crisis conditions. And it is possible, I think, with leadership from Angela Merkel in Germany and perhaps from Francois Hollande in France, the two countries that have really led the European Union, that a better system of resource allocation could be put in place. If Hungary were to be kicked out of the European Union, that would not be a total dystopia. I mean, I hope it doesn't happen. I'd much rather have Orban, of course, kicked out before the country is kicked out. But Hungary is a real problem case now. And I do see this as a very severe pressing problem that could conceivably lead to tighter integration and more effective integration, but only with massive commitment of resources to deal with the growing number of problems like the one we've seen in Croatia in the last 2 days.
Keith and Nicola, do you want to say something? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, so Michael, I share your dystopian science fiction taste. So, I mean, there are elements of, I mean, so in answer to some of the questions that came before, I hope that by alluding to Saskia Sassen's work, I gave you a reference to someone who does take this systemic level very seriously and is articulating that in very powerful ways. So the book Expulsions, which I referenced, which came out in 2014, precisely takes on, and I obviously didn't choose a good piece of it to share with you, but she is precisely pointing to the implication of both commercial and military operations headed by the US and its allies in generating outcomes like the ones we're seeing right now. So the work is there. I mean, what I was trying to do in my comments is point to the fact that the knowledge is there. As ever, it's the knowledge-action gap. And so Nick's point about who can do what is very useful. I'm not sure I have the same conservative, I don't have the same realist attachment to the nation state. The Macedonian border activists I made reference to, one of the things that social media allows to happen is that Amy Goodman, for example, on Democracy Now! Found her way to this activist and asked her, well, what's the message you want to send? And her slogan was, protect people, not borders, which I took as a kind of call for the imagination. Why do people feel so much, why are our imaginations tied to a barbed wire fence on the ground as opposed to reaching across the barbed wire fence to recognize the common humanity of the people on the other side? That's a very long-term vision. I mean, that's 19th century arc of moral justice. The arc of the universe bends towards justice, but it takes a long time, but we have to nudge it. So I don't see an immediate solution. I do see, I have reflected for a while on when the Hunger Games is translated into other languages, where do different countries, which district do they imagine themselves as? Because we're all sitting in District 1. I have a foot in District 2, which is England, I guess, and Macedonia is like District 6 or 7, but for a long time has thought of itself as something else, and now District 12 is coming up, is showing up. So whether the Hunger Games, which if you remember the author specified that she was inspired to write that out of flicking between coverage of the Iraq War and game shows on US television, so really sort of paying attention to the obliviousness, the ability to switch the channel that the US has that the rest of the world doesn't, and was really trying to flag that in that book. So the Hunger Games is one. The message of hope, I guess, is that John Christopher and other dystopian science fiction novelists were writing about similar catastrophes back in the 1960s, about mass population movements. and so far we've muddled through. So I guess that's my British hope, that we'll muddle through this one.
Perhaps before thinking about the potential dystopian future, I think we should acknowledge the fact that migrants themselves are doing something. So even before asking ourselves what should we do, we should acknowledge the fact that these people doing things, moving, are creating a political challenge, which is it's tragic, or it has tragic manifestations, but it contains an element of tragic beauty. I mean, the fact that the boundaries and the borders of the nation state are challenged, and the traditional, also to go back to the other questions, what does it mean to citizenship? The fact that the very idea and the borders of citizenship are challenged by these physical acts and even by the violence which they entail. I think it's something that should be acknowledged and should be acknowledged as a social movement. Otherwise, we lose track of the fact that those people are doing things. And there is, again, for me, there is a beauty. I mean, I think that it implies a rethinking, not simply of policies, but of the whole notion of citizenship. And it raises a question of radical equality. I mean, when we go back to the idea of Dublin and the Dublin Conventions and how legally this tragedy has been built, and our system of repression of migrants has been built, we should acknowledge the fact that this movement is precisely mining the foundations of that kind of order. And if we lose pieces of Europe, if certain kind of certainties disintegrate, I don't think it's a bad thing, because it would mean that Europe is not anymore what it has continued to be until now. And Europe shouldn't be Dublin's Europe. Europe shouldn't be even Schengen's Europe. Europe should be a place in which people could, like white people do when they go outside, people could travel freely and enter freely Europe, because Dublin is doing basically this. It's saying you have to apply for asylum only in the first country, the country of arrival, which means that if you are a migrant and you cannot reach Germany legally, the only thing you can do is to push the borders, the physical borders of the sea, the physical borders of the East. And I think that in this process there is something important, and hopefully something will disintegrate. Not asylum, but something else.
Thank you. So, as a testimony to the importance of this topic and to the great, brilliant people that we have here, that there's a lot of people still sitting here, even though we're over time. And there's also 5 people still lined up. So, in respect to that, I would ask that if you would forgive me, to ask you to stay a little bit longer. And let's hear out these 5 questions all at once. That is to say, take some time, each one of you, to lay out your question, and then we'll get some responses. And I'd like to start with you, please, because I saw you first, and then second, and then third, and then fourth, and then last, okay? And then that'll be the end of the questions. Do you have anything, Sarah? 1. So we'll add Sarah's question to that as well. Please.
Yes. So many people sense that this story is much more complex than the media is telling us. And I think this gives rise to skepticism, tremendous doubt, counter-narratives. So I want to ask if there's any sense that this huge surge just in the past weeks, months, and whatever is not spontaneous, and that in some way there are forces that are controlling it. You talked about the crime families were mentioned, but going beyond that to other nations that might be punishing certain nations, or a sense of control, some control in the way that we talked about a smaller control, but could this be multinational controlling?
Okay, thank you. So to what extent is this a contrived crisis for political gain? Please.
My name's Aubrey Westfall. I'm a political scientist from Wheaton College. And when I compare the refugee populations that are staying in the countries surrounding Syria and those that are making it to Europe, what is apparent to me is the commodification of Europe's asylum system, in that those who make it there are highly qualified, they're highly educated, they're young, they're vigorous. And this is happening at the same time that European states are trying to push through immigration policies that would attract exactly those kinds of people. So why aren't we fighting in Europe over the Syrian refugees and trying to entice them into our economies? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for that. There is a huge difference in the kinds of refugees that we see during this period. It is true that in recent times, we see a number of middle class and other refugees who speak English, have some resources, are fairly young, with young families, heading that way. Why doesn't Europe embrace them instead of try to keep them out? Yes?
Hi, I'm Shireen. I think this teaching was missing a major component, which is necessary to explain the current crisis, and that's a discussion of the Syrian revolution. And I would like to comment for about a minute about what that discussion should have included. The Syrian revolution began as a grassroots working class revolution, and it was nonviolent for about a year and a half. Meanwhile, the dictator Bashar al-Assad was brutally repressing those who were nonviolently uprising. And the revolution was forced to take arms. Eventually, many were forced to take funding from Saudi, Qatar, Kuwait, and that brought in sectarian rebel fighting that undermined the original demands of the revolution. And now that over half of the Syrian population is displaced, the original revolution is not able to move forward. And as Sarah Tobin mentioned, the international community must put pressure on Assad and on Saudi, Qatar, and Kuwait, and even Russia to stop the backing and the brutality,
Well, thank you very much. You've just added that to the dimension, and I think that was good. But the push factors, I think, need to be addressed a little bit more systematically. Yes.
Hi, I'm William Summers. I'm a student here at Brown. So my question is kind of directed at the earlier talks, which had to do with the emerging the unraveling of the crisis in the nations that are kind of surrounding Syria, and how those are, seem to be much more severe than what's happening, in Europe. And I guess my question is, what can those nations that are being affected, where a 25% increase in the population, and you said Jordan, like what would a nation like that do moving forward from here, and what can you see them doing?
Right. So the impact on Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey especially is something that would also need to be addressed a little bit more systematically. I think we took the questions we wanted to take. I see you standing. Do you have a brief?
Yep.
Okay, and then we'll take Sarah at the end, and that'll be a chance for our panel to respond.
What are some of the consequences, do you think, that further and deeper Russian intervention in Syria would have on the overall quantity of refugees, as well as the places where they may be leaving Syria to go to, and the ways that they may be leaving the country?
Thank you. This is a continuation of sort of the geopolitical dimension that did not get as much attention as maybe it should have. Sarah, do you want to grab a microphone of some sort?
So
this is from the Twitter world, and by the way, for all of you joining us from the outside, thank you very much for watching, and I was very glad to see a number of people here, both faculty and students from surrounding colleges as well.
So this question was about sort of the rhetoric regarding swarming and invasion, and the question is about what are the parallels that you see between this refugee crisis and the sort of general rhetoric regarding immigration from Latin America to the United States?
I see. That is great. So shall we just go in this direction? If you want to say something, you're not forced to.
I think someone asked about the what should these countries do in terms of the countries surrounding Syria itself. And I think there's really not much they can do without more funding. Unfortunately, in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Turkey, funding appeals have reached only half of their goals as of September. So as we see the eyes of the world turn to Europe, they turn away from the Middle East. And obviously this funding, ongoing funding year after year, nearing $1 billion per year isn't sustainable. It's not the kind of approach, or over $1 billion per year, it's not the kind of approach that's sustainable. So long term, I think enabling refugees within the country to engage economically would be one of the first steps. That's easier said than done, especially in Lebanon, where they're already wary of an additional refugee presence in addition to the Palestinians that are already in Lebanon. The Palestinians are also largely economically crippled within Lebanon. And in Jordan, there are economic sort of duty-free zones in the north of the country that people have been suggesting be turned into sort of factories where Syrians could work. It kind of sounds like a sweatshop to me, but I'm not really sure how that would pan out. It could be a way of economically engaging refugees for a long-term situation. What Jordan did for the Palestinians in 1940 was basically gave them citizenship. I don't think that's something that we want to see happening for Syrians because it basically spells the end. So.
I think, and I alluded to this earlier, one of the sort of untold impacts of this large Syrian population coming into neighboring countries of Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan is that the cultural differences, the perceived social differences, linguistic differences, they are becoming further entrenched and deepening and becoming kind of a more durable us versus them framework in popular discussions. And the stereotypes of each of the other is certainly a major part of the way that people talk about the situation and how to remedy it. So you'll hear Jordanians say, for example, well, you know that the Syrians are the most productive and entrepreneurial of all of the Arabs. And so then they'll point to the Champs-Élysées in Zaatari as a case in point, where there's this huge market street that was essentially a black market endeavor that turned into now several streets of market engagement that's unregulated and untaxed. So Jordanians will point to that and say, see, if we just let them do things, they're going to take away all of our jobs and they're going to take away all of these, so popular rhetoric that we find comparable to the Latin American case in the US. And so I do think that the Western world, the media, needs to pay attention to these differences rather than kind of lumping it as, well, all Arabs are the same, which often emerges in discussions more widely about the perceptions of the Middle East.
Yeah, maybe I want to add something about this and the question of commodification. Basically, I think that the fact that there was an immediate interest in Germany for hosting Syrian refugees and tells us something about the problem of all these distinctions that are the fake distinctions which are created between refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants. All these distinctions are functional to governing migrations, but at the end of the day, there is something at the basis of the government of migrations in Europe, which is the question of labor. And all the principles, the transversal principle guiding these distinctions between migrant workers, asylum seekers, and refugees, then at a certain point come together with the idea of labor. And at a certain point, the principle of labor and what do we need, what kind of others do we need constantly reemerges in a way. So I just wanted to add this.
Keith?
So I'll take I'll take a little stab at the Russia reasons behind the manufactured crisis question. I mean, there is, I understand from some colleagues at the Naval War College that there has been a buzz around claims that Russian military doctrine is embracing forms of asymmetrical extended war on a kind of insurgency model. So the idea and the idea of forcing civilian populations out as part of a war strategy, we know from the wars in the former Yugoslavia. It was an element of Slobodan Milosevic's tactics in Kosovo in 1999. That's not. It's not as completely far-fetched and conspiratorial as perhaps it might sound. I mean, there are so you can make security threat arguments about it. It ties into some of the other discussions about securitization. I'd just like to tell one quick story about the period 1903 to 1908, which is another period I'm interested in, and it sort of relates to the US parallels. So in 1903, a man called Tsokas arrived from Ottoman Macedonia and was interviewed in a newspaper about the blood he had seen on the streets and his family being killed, and the fact that he had fled to escape violence both from the regime and from an illicit organization that was trying to tax him because it was waging a war against that government. And it's a tragic story if you read it, but it becomes very complicated when you then find out that in 1908 the federal government prosecuted Tsokas and sent him to jail for his subsequent involvement in human trafficking. There's a huge there's a huge industry which blurs the lines of refugees and migrants and makes all of this very complicated. Our colleague Peter Andreas at the Watson Institute is a specialist on these forms of illicit economy and their security dimensions. So if people were interested in the Brown community knowing more about these kind of arguments, especially out of political science, he would be a great resource.
Nick.
Thanks. I would like to make a quick remark about the nation state, as much in response to Keith and Nicola as anything else. My view on this is that we should recognize the centrality of the nation state as a form of order, but never accept it as the exclusive form of order. And that's precisely why refugee flows are so important as a case where there are other channels of intervention. And given the richness of the presentations and the knowledge of the other speakers, I really didn't want to take much time even to mention channels of intervention, but there are many person-to-person as well as non-governmental channels for taking action, and a teach-in like this one is, I think, the condition for thinking about what action steps to take. As you think about that, the way you might, if you're interested in doing so, plug into the international order and take even small steps to try to improve the way our structures of power address the plight of displaced persons. That's a very interesting question. What do you really want to do? You can certainly write to members of the US government. The figure of 10,000 refugees from Syria accepted by the United States is absolutely shocking. And, you know, in a pluralist democracy, legislators, do they respond to constituent letters? No. You don't have to spend a lot of time being eloquent. They count them up. You know, if you take 7.5 minutes to write somebody in Washington to say the United States should be accepting more than 10,000 Syrian refugees, depending on who your representative is, they might be surprised, but it gets counted someplace. The question that's interesting is that what you want to do, or do you want to make a financial contribution, maybe very small, to established NGOs? Do you want to find more grassroots organizations? All of those questions are really interesting, but when you think about the encounters we've heard about, you can imagine that any of these steps could make a small yet decisive difference for somebody on the ground, displaced, looking for a new home, or looking for a better place to survive. So I think this is a very compelling and interesting case of recognizing that nation states, for better or worse, really matter, but they're not the only form of order that we want to accept as the exclusive road to action by any means. There are many others, and all well worth thinking about. I think the speakers have given us lots of different ways of thinking about it. So again, thank you very much for the chance to contribute, and thanks for everybody's attention.
All right, so I will just say in conclusion that we've managed to transverse a very big distance between really on-the-ground, micro sort of look at some of the situation all the way to the very large systemic issues. And we realize in that journey that there's a lot more that can be said, that what's happening in Europe in many ways is it encapsulates the transformations of the world order as a whole and the kind of challenges that we're facing in the 21st century. So I would urge you to take advantage of the resources that are available at Brown, everything from the kinds of special projects we do in Middle East studies relating to the Syria crisis, to courses, to the call by University Senior Administration recently for people to bring ideas to the university so the university can do something, to specific contacts you might have. There's a big Syrian community in Providence, and many of them have relatives there, etc. There's many ways you can undertake that journey yourself. Just keep plugged in, and we're very happy to see you here. Thank you for staying up so late with us as we talk about this important issue.